the second passage on the SAT number 17. This is the April QAS test from 2019. And what we're going to do is we're just going to look at the passage real quick and sort of break it down into what I think is maybe one of the better ways to look at it, the ways to look at sort of the structure of it, some key things to point out. So if you were having trouble with the comprehension of it, or if you just want to follow along on the videos and you want to have sort of a bedrock of what's going on in this passage, you can just watch this video. So let's jump in here. So first thing we can look is at this title, which is Extremist Politics, Debating the Nuts and Bolts. So all this really tells us is that the topic is extremist politics, but doesn't really go too much into detail about what the passage is about. So let's move on. We can look at the intro. So this starts by saying voters need to understand the prosaic details of complex policies. It continues to say that many people have staked out positions, really strong opinions about policies, but they don't really have strong explanations, right? They don't often have reasoned positions. So even though they have strong positions, they're not often reasoned. Instead, what they have are simplistic explanations. Then we go down to say that psychological scientists, they call this the illusion of explanatory depth. So even though people have very strong opinions about certain politics or certain policies, basically they don't have a deep understanding. They have an illusion of explanatory depth. So we strongly believe that we understand complex matters when in fact we are clueless, and these false and extreme beliefs shape our preferences, etc. So that's sort of, I would say that these two paragraphs here sort of go together and basically outlining sort of the psychological stance that a lot of people have, where basically they think that they understand things, but in reality they don't understand them as deeply as they think. Then we get this question here: is it possible to shake such deep-rooted convictions? That's the question that Philip Fernbach, a psychological scientist, etc., wanted to explore. So this is a very common pattern on SAT science passages where you start with sort of an explanation of some kind of phenomenon, some kind of finding, or some kind of like past research or some kind of question, basically an introduction to some topic. And then immediately we're introduced either in the second paragraph or in this case the third paragraph. But pretty early on, we're introduced to a scientist who set out some sort of experiment to either answer the question that's mentioned in the beginning, or to sort of explore a particular detail of this phenomenon or of this question. So that's exactly the pattern that we get here. We're introduced to overall people's psychological stance on their political beliefs. Then we're introduced to this scientist here, and he wants to basically see if it's possible to shake these deep-rooted convictions. So then we continue, etc. They ran a series of lab experiments to test this idea. So his idea was that if forcing people to explain complex politics in detail, right, would force them to confront their ignorance and thus weaken their extremist stance on an issue. So this scientist, he wanted to see if he could shake people's conviction, and his idea was like if you have people explain a policy in very close detail, not advocating for it, but just explaining it, then you're going to shake their ignorance. They have to understand that they're ignorant, and basically they're going to relax their conviction on this issue. So let's continue. They started by recruiting. So at this point here, there's a very common thing that you're going to get in science passages where basically you move as you go through the experiment. You're going to get the methodology of the experiment. This is explaining who the group of volunteers were, how they set up the experiment, the design of the experiment, what they tested, etc. So honestly, when I read this, I sort of skip this whole paragraph because I just know that these are details I can come back later to understand. But all of these are basically just explaining this experiment, and I already know what the purpose of the experiment is, so I can kind of skip past it. His idea was such that an exercise would force many to realize just how little they really know, kind of a recapitulation of what he already said was his hypothesis, etc., etc. They would be humbled, and then we get this, the findings, and that's just what happened. Trying and failing to explain complex policies undermined the extremist illusions about being well informed. They became more moderate in their views as a result. So this is basically the extremists. They looked at their views, and as they tried to explain their policies, they realized that they were kind of ignorant, and they had to sort of adjust their opinions. So that's the result of this experiment. So far, so good. So being forced to articulate the nuts and bolts is not the same as trying to sell that policy. In fact, talking about one's views can strengthen them. He believes it's the slow, etc. So this is sort of some analysis of the experiment, and basically what he's saying is that it's the slow, deliberate attempt to explain a policy that's what makes people shake their judgment. But he wanted to look at a second idea, which is basically that instead of explaining a policy, what would happen if you just listed reasons for liking it. So his sort of idea is that it's the fact of explaining, of getting into what we call in the title the nuts and bolts, right, of a policy, getting into the deep mechanics of it. That's what makes people shape and change their convictions about that policy. But Fernbach wanted to know what happens if you just list reasons for liking it. What's going to happen? And then we say the results are clear. So we have a second experiment, and what are the results? Those who simply listed their reasons for their policies were less shaken in their views. Right? They continued to think they understood the policies in their complexity, and they remained extreme in their passions for their position. So this is in contrast to the first experiment, which showed that people became more relaxed in their conviction. And what we see here is that people became they stayed the same in their extremity on their position. So basically, if you just list the reasons for why you like a policy, you don't actually change your opinion. You basically keep the same. You're still convicted. You're like, yeah, these reasons are pretty good. I think I'm pretty smart and pretty right on. So then we get this last little paragraph here, which talks about the fact that polarization tends to reinforce itself. So that polarization is basically pulling towards one extreme. So this is political extremism. It reinforces itself because people seek out knowledge that will support their own idea, right? They hang out with people who are just like them, etc. And these are psychological forces that force people to or keep people sort of locked in these beliefs. But then they end with this recommendation that forcing a candidate, right, or political candidates to provide concrete and elaborate plans might be a start. So they sort of provide a possible way of addressing political extremism by saying if you ask politicians to explain their plans in concrete, specific detail, that would help reduce political extremism. Then we get the figures, two figures here, and then we jump right into the passage. So that's overall sort of what the passage is about. I hope this helped you a little bit, maybe gave you a little bit of context. Leave a comment below so you can give me any suggestions that you think will be helpful for you in the future. And that is it. Let's jump into the passage now.